David BOLLIER. He doesn't have a book to hawk right now, but he's written some wonderful stuff about his focus these days is on the commons, on what we own together. So a lot of his work nowadays is on the Internet. His next book is Viral Spiral, How the Commoners Built a Digital Republic, which will come out in 2009. But I want to talk to him about, with all this talk of the commons and what we own in common, where do bailouts fit in with that? Do we own these bailouts? Do we get anything for them? What's the common interest in that? So David BOLLIER is the editor of onthecommons.org. He's the co-founder of Public Knowledge, the author of Brand Name Bullies, The Quest to Own and Control Culture, Silent Theft, The Private Plunder of Our Commonwealth, and coming in 2009, Viral Spiral, How the Commoners Built a Digital Republic. You can learn more about his work at www.bollier, BOLLIER.org. Welcome, David BOLLIER.
It's great to be here.
Okay. I remember when I first sent you an email and said, I got this wacky idea. If we're talking about the commons, where does that fit in with the bailouts and the, we have a common crisis and we're taking all these very much, we all own the solutions in a way. But before we get into that, if you could just explain to people a little bit what has become your focus. I met you years ago when you were talking about businesses that were doing well and doing good and so on. But this focus on the commons, what does it mean to you and what are we really talking about when we talk about that?
Well, I've come to realize that a lot of the prevailing political discourse we have is just not getting at the fundamental problems. And that is the problem, that we don't have a broader vocabulary, sensibility of talking about these things. And I find that the commons is one way that we can begin to talk about, the things we share in common as human beings and as a culture, but also the things that we own as a nation. We own huge amounts of public lands with valuable minerals and timber. We created the Internet and all the protocols for it. We finance all sorts of drug research that we give away for virtually nothing to drug companies who then own exclusive patents on it. We create stadiums in civic areas that then a company gets to name for paying a fraction of the actual value of it all. So it goes on and on. The commons is a way of talking about these things that we share and then beginning to assert an identity and affiliation. That belongs to me. I want to control it. I want to own it and not just give it away to some corporate latecomer.
Okay, so the commons is what we share. I have a sense that if you go back and look at the founding documents of this country, it's very present. It's in the air. It's this thing that they were creating. It has had its battles over the years, and what you and I and so many know is that it's really taken it on the commons have really taken it on the chin for the last 30 years or so.
Well, the Declaration of Independence says it, we the people. And that's sort of a rather foundational concept. And the idea was to create a government that could protect the general welfare and protect the commons. What we've seen, of course, over the past generation is that government has been seduced and betrayed, often quite willingly, and even by many Democrats, into forgetting about their oversight responsibilities and forgetting about protecting these assets, the way that commercial airwaves, for example, we give them away free to broadcasters, even though they're a valuable part of their infrastructure. Or, I can go on and on in that regard. But the point is, government is not exercising its job properly, and therefore it's important for us to, we the people in a way, reconceptualize these resources as ours and begin to agitate to get them back. It's sort of the commons, of course, comes from the medieval times and English history when the aristocrats decided they wanted to seize the lands, the pastures, the forests that were being used by everyone for their subsistence and turn it into a market resource for their own private purposes. And I love this great protest poem that the Bob Dylan of his time wrote where they hang the man and flog the woman that steal the goose from off the common, but let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose. And that's really kind of a metaphor for our time.
Yeah, very much so. And so actually in some sense then, when I spoke of the Founding Fathers and so on and the initial ideals in which the country was, the government in some sense was also of the commons. In other words, the government ostensibly is something that is ours.
Yes, but it's what I see is that it's not just government and market being the only significant power players or significant ways to create wealth. I see the commons as this intermediate sector where people on their own, without necessarily having law, government, or markets involved, can create immensely valuable things. And the best examples are probably online.
I was going to say, before we actually talk about the crisis and the bailouts, share just a little bit about how this all applies to the Internet and the online world, because that's been a focus of you and certainly is a revolutionary entity.
Well, one of the most surprising things is how in the past 5 years especially, but for things like open source software over the past 10 or 15 years, how the commons has created phenomenal value without the traditional structures of markets. There's been no corporations, no lawyers, no advertising, none of that overhead, which incidentally is very expensive. You've had people who were volunteers create such things as Linux, a fabulously complicated operating system. You've had Wikipedia, you've had the photo sharing site Flickr, you've had the social networking sites and Facebook and MySpace. It goes on. And while, yes, there are often corporate sponsors of these sites, the value is not created through a market exchange or a cash exchange. It's created through social communities of trust, people sharing things freely without charging each other. And it's not as if the market can't coexist in this space, but much of the significant value has been created through this new paradigm called the commons.
I really hear that. In other words, I hadn't quite grasped that, but you're right, that the value in these things, there would be no value if the network didn't show up, if the network didn't care, if the network didn't communicate.
And what's fascinating is if some of these host companies for certain commons, like MySpace or Facebook, start to abuse those communities by being too aggressive about violating privacy or introducing too much advertising, people will say, forget that, I'm going elsewhere. In other words, to make money off of some of these commons, you have to respect the community and the value that it's creating. So this is kind of a new phenomenon.
So now let's take it to these bailouts. What is, in other words, when I got this slot and I thought, what's an interesting take on this? How do these two kinds of things fit together? This idea that we have a commons and this idea that suddenly the government is putting enormous amounts of our money into the market, taking shares of assets and so on. What would, in some sense, that wouldn't be so bad. But how does it fit? How do you see it from someone who's taking the commons perspective?
Well, it's partly, this is not just a financial crisis, although it certainly is that. It's kind of a cultural crisis of how we make sense of these things. And traditionally we've said, well, that free market ideology says that we don't really need government, we don't really need society. Margaret Thatcher famously said there is no society, as if free markets can operate in a total vacuum. But of course, this bailout has shown that society, governments, law are tremendously important to the successful functioning of so-called free markets.
Well, let me even say, you said this bailout, but the crisis which called for the bailout showed the lack thereof.
Yes. Yeah. The bailout made this visible.
Right.
It's always been the case.
Yeah.
I mean, people wouldn't have trust in markets if there wasn't an SEC and all the disclosures that are needed for Wall Street. It's the regulation of government that makes markets trustworthy, or at least are supposed to. But as we talked earlier, government has abandoned many of these functions. But the larger point is markets need the commons to function successfully, and that the prices that we saw were not reflecting the actual contributions of value and risk-taking that government was taking, and that was being displaced onto other people but not acknowledged.
Mm-hmm. I see. In other words, value got way out of kilter, the value of risk, leverage, the things that were being exchanged, and you needed a referee.
And I think the problem is that the crisis has exposed the fraudulent correlation between price and value, and this has caused essentially a collapse. And our problem is how to reconstruct the economy in a way that we trust the correlation between prices and value.
Yeah. And let me an idea that I threw out to you off air that has occurred to me, and I'm going to throw this one to you, which may be the last question you really have time to answer, which is that I see our society, our culture, suffering a crisis of accountability. First, the crisis of Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, and so on, were corporations who were cheating, greedy, corrupt, but the accounting firms, the Arthur Andersons and folks that were supposed to be watching them, were colluding. Then we have the Iraq War. Forget how we got in. Once we're in, it's been funded by emergency supplementals the entire time, which makes no sense. It's no longer an emergency. We're 5 years in. And when I asked a Democrat congressional expert why they didn't move for making it part of the budget, he said, well, then they'd be accountable. They'd have to make hard choices. So in some sense, we see it there as well. And then finally, with the Bear Stearns, the AIG, the Citibank, and so on, the Standard & Poor's and Moody's, who were supposed to be providing the accountability to were these securities, were they worthwhile? They didn't take their responsibility. I think we're suffering this accountability. How does that fit into this whole argument?
Well, I think it fits in this way, that we've reached a level of such centralization, scale, and lack of transparency that it's irresistible to game the system, and indeed there's many opportunities to do that. So in all the institutions that you mentioned, those people at the centralized hub of where these transactions occur are able to intervene for their own self-dealing purposes, and it can't even be detected because there isn't the transparency. But it amounts to a major institutional failure that we need to rectify somehow, and one has the hope, the aspiration that the Obama administration will wade into this thicket. But I totally agree with you. We have a major institutional lack of accountability.
And it's strange that I'm not wanting to pat myself on the back, but it's strange that we haven't had more about this, because it's the thing for me that says we're a risk-taking entrepreneurial culture, both politically and in terms of business and culture and so on. And so we need that more than others. You know, we can't depend on the fact that we're going to play it conservative. We're going to play it to the edge, and unless we have accountability, we're in trouble. If I gave you 20 seconds, where do you think it might come from?
It has to come from the bottom. It's not going to come from themselves. Everybody's too implicated in gaming the system for their selfish advantage. So the people who are outside that system, who aren't the direct beneficiaries or who are being victimized by it, namely we, the commoners, need to interject ourselves into this whole process and bring some accountability back.
Very good. Okay, you've been listening to David Bollier. His website is bollier.org. That's BOLLIER. A lot of interesting thought about the commons, about the internet, about the future, and so on. And a book coming out in 2009, Viral Spiral, How the Commoners Built a Digital Republic. Thank you, David Bollier. Keep up the good work.
I went walking that ribbon of highway I saw above me. In the skyway I saw below me the golden valley. This land